And welcome back to Coast. George Norrie with you. Mark Ireland with us. First-time guest is the Assister of Helping Parents Heal. Now, that's an organization with more than 24,000 members that assists bereaved parents worldwide. He has participated in mediumship research studies conducted by the University of Arizona and the University of Virginia, and currently operates a medium certification program, which we'll talk about as well. His book is called The Persistence of the Soul. Mark, welcome to the program.
Hey, George. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
And under, unfortunately, very sad circumstances, if you would, if it's not too painful, if you could tell us what happened.
Absolutely. So I guess as a precursor to my story of what brought me back into my father's realm, my dad was a pretty prominent psychic and medium who practiced mainly in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, and eventually became a counselor to Mae West, Amanda Blake, David Jansen, some other Hollywood celebrity types, and I even have a handwritten note from Mamie Eisenhower written to him in 1956 when he married my mom. So
he would have been a regular on this program had we been around then.
Yeah, I know. He was ahead of his time.
Yeah.
But, I grew up with that father, and I saw not only the psychic stuff, but the spirit messages coming through at times with great specificity, first and last names, details. So even as a kid, I saw this, and I had a confidence that, man, there really is more than just this. There is another realm beyond this. And growing up with that, it gave me a level of confidence. But I took my own path. How many of us really want to be our parent, right?
That's right.
So I went to college, got a degree, got married at a pretty young age, and had a couple of kids. If you fast forward, my 18-year-old son, my younger of my two sons, Brandon, was hiking in the mountains, or going to go for a hike in the mountains behind our Scottsdale, Arizona home at the time. And that particular day, I just had this kind of bad feeling, or almost like a premonition that he shouldn't go, but I couldn't talk him out of it. And he was 18, and his last words to me, "We're going, Dad." So he went on this hike. My wife and I were across town for most of the day. I get a call later in the day from the boys, or actually from my older son, who intercepted a call from the other boys on the mountain who were with Brandon. They said he was having trouble passing out and so on. So they asked me to call 911, which I did. We rushed back. By the time we got there was a horde of spectators, and ambulance, fire truck, and a helicopter came down. And a short time later, we learned that our son had passed. We didn't know the cause of death initially. All I could get was what his best friend who was with him and tried to revive him had said. And that boy, Stu, told me that, Brandon had reported that his heart was beating fast and his arms were kind of numb. And then I guess he vomited shortly after that. And then he says, "I have to lay down." And he laid down and didn't wake up again. So that's really kind of what led me, to get back into my dad's field and look at it from a different perspective, obviously.
Did he go into atrial fibrillation or something?
So here's what happened. We didn't get an autopsy report for about a week, but at this point in time, my dad had been gone for a number of years, but I had an uncle who was still alive with similar abilities, and I talked to him briefly the day it happened, and about 3 days, he asked if there's anything he could do for me, and I said, if you can get any kind of message or connection, I'd really appreciate it. And 3 days later, I was in the mortuary making arrangements. We connected by cell phone, and he told me, he says, last night I tried to connect and I got nothing, but this morning I was doing my meditation. It's how I start every day. And your dad came to me, and he looked the same as he always has, and he hadn't seen me in a long time, but I have had connection with him since he passed. He said he was there when Brandon crossed over. He helped Brandon adjust. Brandon was a little confused in the beginning, and that he wanted you to know you're the best parents he ever could have had. But what he gave me along with that, the feel-good message, was the evidence. He said, your dad said Brandon's death was caused by a lack of oxygen in his bloodstream that caused his heart to fail. So the autopsy was conducted a day or two later. I got a call from that physician, and she told me that death was caused by a severe asthma attack that had causes blood oxygen levels to drop, leading to cardiac arrest. So my uncle essentially told me the cause of death 2 days before it was official.
And this led you on your path?
It was probably the first step, yeah. It led me down this path of kind of re-engaging with my dad's field. See, I was always proud of my dad, and I would always take friends to see him and things like that. But it's not like it was the front and focused, most predominant thing in my life that I was focused on. But it did, yeah. It brought me back into this, and there's a number of remarkable things that kind of lined up right after this that almost made it seem like it was a synchronistic thing.
We'll get into that in a second, Mark. Did your father try to force feed any of this towards you?
Not really. I mean, he always told people that he thought I was psychic, but he had said other people were psychic too. Well, now I know everybody's psychic to some degree. It's just how much you have of it and how much you trust it or use it or even are aware of it. But no, he never forced me to do, that. It was pretty much, he wanted me to be my own person and take my own path. And even just before he passed, I saw him like 2 weeks before. He told me he was proud of me. And, at that point in my life, it was pretty much a business career that I had done.
Was your family related to the actress Jill Ireland by any chance?
No relation. No, nor Kathy Ireland.
I bet you get that a lot, don't you?
Yeah, I used to, but I guess that they're not as big a name as they used to be.
Nobody remembers her anymore.
No, it's kind of a shame. Yeah, and part of this, too, is, has been enabled me to kind of restore my dad's legacy to some degree because I think he's just unknown by a lot of folks, but he was tremendously gifted and helped a lot of folks.
What have you learned about the afterlife?
Well, here's the thing. I mean, the first thing I look at is what evidence sources do we have? Mediumship is one, and I've got a lot of experience, with that in dealing with mediums. I've actually know a few of the ones that you've had on, like Michelle Clare and Suzanne Wilson,
sure,
and other researchers like Tricia Robertson from the Scottish Society of Psychical Research. The nature of the afterlife itself, I guess we could all speculate what it's like. My view of it is, you're a soul in a body, and when you leave here, the part of you that's non-physical gravitates to the plane of existence where you belong. And I think there may be various planes, but general terms, I lean on kind of what a lot of the NDE researchers, how they describe things. And actually, my dad had some thoughts about it too, that make it sound like it's an environment, if you will, that exudes love and compassion, acceptance, a deeper love than you can even experience here on Earth. But it's the soul purpose is for progression and to evolve, and that's why we come here and go through some of this suffering that we do. And some of it's not all suffering, but my thought is we grow through that process, and this world maybe refines you faster than being on the other side, because if you're in a realm without all the challenges, or where you have to be cognizant of giving and caring for others and then things like that, maybe this world stretches you a bit more, but maybe takes you, refines your soul to a greater degree. So maybe that's a nebulous answer, but I don't know that any of us knows exactly how to describe that, being here.
What are some of the remarkable things that have happened to you, Mark, that continue to lead you to believe that this is the real thing?
Well, there's been so many. I'll just go back to right after my son passed, but it was about a month later. I was watching the NBC affiliate news station in Phoenix, and they were showing information about a study being done at the University of Arizona at the time, where mediums were being giving readings under blinded conditions where they couldn't see the sitter. The sitter couldn't see them, so there's no chance of cold reading. And a lot of really phenomenal information was being shared. It was very specific. And the first medium I saw in there was Alison Dubois, who later became famous because of the network show Medium. And I thought, wow, I'd love to be in that lab someday, and I'd love to get a reading from Alison Dubois. Little did I know both of those things would later happen. In fact, the very next day I got a call from a man named Jerry Conser who knew my dad. He was friends with my dad, and he called me and he says, hey, Mark, I know what you've been through, and I know someone who might be able to help you. Her name is Alison Dubois. And then he gave me a phone number I could call to get an appointment, which I did have later that year. And then I ended up in the lab for actually there was a Discovery Channel feature filmed the day I was there, and the medium that read for me in the lab for that particular time was Lori Campbell. But some of the affirmations that came through those readings were quite remarkable. Taking the Alison Dubois one, for example, she went in there with very limited knowledge of me. I tried to kind of, in most of these, tried to shield my identity, or at least how much anyone could know about me, just so I know that it's the real deal. But she, 2 weeks before I met her or went in for that reading, I met a person who my dad had a manuscript that was never published, and it was in a box with 8.5 by 11 pages stacked up. It was called Your Psychic Potential, A Guide to Psychic Development. And this fellow hands this to me, and he says, here, this is, your dad wrote this book years ago, 1973. And I said, well, how'd you get it? And he said, well, you were out of state at the time, and before your dad passed, he gave it to me for safekeeping. And I'm like, well, why are you giving this to me now? And he says, I don't know. I just feel like I'm supposed to. Well, the reading with Alison was 2 weeks after that. And very early in the reading, she says, I have your father here, and he's showing me a book, but I think it's his book, and it's for you to take forward. Does that make sense to you? And I'm like, yeah, that makes sense. And I've subsequently been able to get that book published, which is pretty cool. And then she had a number of other things. She also shared from my son, happy 25th anniversary, which my wife and I had just had about 2 months before that, and she would have had no way of knowing that. She came through with a number of names that made sense and other information, but it was a really good reading.
What do you say, Mark, to people who don't believe in the afterlife?
Well, you can only say so much. It depends on their perspective. If they're open-minded and willing to consider evidence, that's one thing. And that's really this book that I put out. It's got personal stories, but it also has the scientific evidence to back it up in there. I think you need somebody with an open mind. You can be a skeptic, but not a debunker. If you've already made up your mind and you're a physicalist or / materialist, and you think that consciousness is just an epiphenomenon of the brain and there's nothing more than matter, then I'm going to just waste my breath talking to somebody like that. But somebody who's open-minded, I can share evidence and personal stories of things, and they can have their own experiences too, whether that's with a medium or through some other practice. Even, I think it was 2 or 3 days after Brandon passed, I wanted my own kind of connection before I ever met with any mediums. And I just went into a darkened closet and tried to meditate and concentrate and just ask for something to come through. And within a reasonable period of time, I had an image of my son's face smiling, kind of scrolling across, and then shortly right after that was a cross with an oval loop at the top. And I'd seen those, but I didn't really know what they meant. So I went and Googled it and found that it's an Ankh, which is the oldest cross of human history. The lower portion represents physical life, and the upper oval loop represents eternal life. So what I had there was a message that I had to decipher, that I didn't know what it meant. It kind of conveyed to me, hey, your son's fine, he's happy, and he's in the afterlife. But there's so much evidence out there through the near-death research stuff, through mediumship studies. But I think the best thing is people have their own experiences, and those direct experiences are what really will change you and change your way of thinking.
Was your first book called Soul Shift?
That's correct. It was Soul Shift, and that was kind of the story that I'm talking about now is kind of the precursor to the persistence of the soul. But yes, that was the first book. And that was more of a memoir, and it journaled all these experiences that happened, immediately after, including the first 4 readings that I had, and then information about some of the other experiences. One of the most remarkable had to do with my wife, actually. And this one was not through a medium. This is a direct experience, so therefore very compelling. Well, we were going to take our son Brandon on a cruise for his graduating from high school. And since he had passed, we took our older son and we took Brandon's best friend, Stu, who I mentioned earlier. We went on this cruise. We came back, and this is 6 months after Brandon had passed. And my wife was sitting at the foot of our bed, and while there, she felt a presence with her that she knew it was Brandon, and she actually saw a shadow figure out of her peripheral vision.
Wow.
Now, here's what even makes it more compelling. The very next day, we get a call from someone else. Now, this person, his name's James Linton. Brandon was a bass player, and James is a musician. He needed to borrow a bass while we were gone, and so Susie loaned him Brandon's bass. Well, he calls the very next day after Susie's experience. He has no knowledge of her experience, and he says, "Hey, Susie, got something to tell you, but I don't know how to share this." And she's afraid he broke the bass or something. But he says, I was recording this song, and while I was in the studio, I felt another presence in there with me, and I saw a shadow figure out of my peripheral vision. Then I saw flashes of white light, and I thought I was hallucinating. So I went and drank water. I took a shower. I got something to eat. But every time it just came back stronger and stronger. And finally I said, "Okay, Brandon, what do you want?" And he said that he was then guided to redo this song and redo the words. And it came out as something called The Other Side. And he said, "This is the best song I've ever written, but I didn't write it."
Wow.
So, to have my wife's experience backed up by someone with an identical experience the next day was pretty compelling.
And a lot of times they attach themselves to special objects that they had in their life, don't they?
I think so, yeah. I think we had, people talk about signs and things like that. And a lot of the time that can be tied to music or things like that. I think in his case, we knew one of his, even though he was a young guy, he loved the band Pink Floyd. And so the song "Wish You Were Here" has always been kind of a connector for us. And it's come on at some really interesting times.
Mark, are your 2 books, The Persistence of the Soul and Soul Shift, people can pick it up where, Amazon?
Yeah, I have links to everything on my website if they want to go there, including all the, all the Amazons overseas as well. But yeah, it's available at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and I'm sure many independent bookstores. But if they want to buy it online, they can either just go to my site and pick the retailer they want, and or they can just order it on Amazon.
All right, we're going to come back and talk more about your work with some of the bereaved parents, with Helping Parents Heal, and also your medium certification program, what that is, when we come back. And welcome back to Coast. George Norrie with you, Mark Ireland with us. His second book is called The Persistence of the Soul, which, Mark, you wrote about your sister that passed. What happened?
So this goes back a number of years, but she developed pancreatic cancer, and then it metastasized to her liver. But it was usually pancreatic cancer takes people pretty fast, but she had a bit of time, probably a little over a year before she got to that point. But when she was in hospice and the time was winding down, there were some unusual things that happened. But I had an idea, and I ran it by her, which was, really based on the whole Houdini code. If people are familiar with that, Harry Houdini had an agreement with his wife, Beatrice, that he had a secret code with her, and that, if a medium or anyone could bring that through after his death, then she'd know that he still existed. And which is kind of ironic because he's always perceived as being, a debunker of mediums or, somebody to try to put them down, which he did a lot of that.
Right.
But in the back of his mind, he apparently still had some open-mindedness and was interested or curious. But then a famous medium named Arthur Ford actually solved that. Although if you try and look it up today, it'll never mention that. It'll say it remains unsolved. But he did solve it, and the code was Beatrice Believe. But then the skeptics and debunkers climbed out of the woodwork and claimed that, well, you must have known, or it was common knowledge, or the two of you were in cahoots. And the wife denied it. But today it's kind of left up in the air. But I thought, if my sister wanted to do something like this, we'd better, what was the flaw in that kind of an experiment? And from my perspective, the problem was that any living person knew the code. Because then if no living person knew the code, you couldn't allege, that someone leaked it. So she wrote a phrase, put it on a piece of paper in a sealed envelope, and left it behind. And she knew that after she passed, that I was going to reach out to a number of mediums to try and get that code. And it was a pretty extensive process. So one of the chapters in the books really documents that. I don't want to give away the punchline because it's a long story. But I would just say that I felt it was successful, not maybe exactly perfectly, but I think it hit the mark, and it was a good thing to try, and if other folks might get ideas from that of other types of experiments that they might develop along the way too. So that's what happened with my sister and that experiment.
Mark, what does this tell you about the survival of consciousness?
Well, for one thing, I think consciousness is primary, and it's not an epiphenomenon of the brain, as I mentioned earlier, that we are souls and we are conscious entities, and that continues on. How that is conveyed or communicated to us after they leave this realm, and we're operating through a brain, which is receiving and sending information, the modes of communication are limited, and a lot of the mediums I've talked to, in fact, I have a chapter in here on an interview with two mediums, and the reason I did that was to clarify people's understanding of how they get information, because I think a lot of folks just don't get, well, why don't they just tell you this, or why don't they just tell you that verbatim? But it's a little more subtle than that. Depending on the individuals who are doing it, they may have different modes of communication. Some are going to see it more visually. Some are going to hear like more of an auditory thing, but maybe not like through hearing through your ears. I can give you an example.
Sure.
And this is one that actually I get this stuff sporadically a little bit, but I've never really tried to work with it like my father did. But a medium friend of mine, Tina Powers, she and I, for a 3-year stretch, had gone to this spiritualist church in San Francisco called the Golden Gate Spiritualist Church. And I would do a talk, and she would do readings for the congregation members afterwards. Well, this particular time, she was saying, hey, Mark, I think you're going to get a message. If you do, would you share it with the congregation? And I said, sure. But she kept bringing this up like she was afraid I wouldn't do it, and I told her I would do it. So the day comes, we're going into the church. She reminds me one more time, Mark, will you share any messages you might get? And I said, sure. So, and again, this isn't normally how things work for me, but I went into the church, they had a healing room, and I sat down on a bench to an organ or piano, and I just tried to quiet my mind to prepare myself for the talk that I was going to give. And I just was kind of in a meditative state, and my mind went blank, which is very rare. I have a hard time shutting it down, but I got it to go totally blank. And while I was in that state, a name popped in, and it was Max. Now, I didn't hear it. I didn't see it. It came to me just like an idea. And then right on the heels of getting Max, I got Maxine. I thought, oh, maybe it's Maxine and not Max. That's all I got. I got nothing else. Now, this church was founded by a woman named Florence Becker, I think in 1924, and she passed in 1970. And by all accounts, she had abilities very similar to my father. And the reason I say that is because when my talk was done, I said to the congregation, Tina made me promise that I would share anything I get. Did the names Max or Maxine mean anything to anyone here? And the pastor, his name's Del Lauterbach, his jaw dropped, and he said, well, Max and Maxine were twins born to the church founder, Florence Becker. They were stillborn and grew up on the other side. He says, I think we know who is here right now. So I could see then why Tina pushed me to share that, because it was such a subtle thing. I could have just said, oh, that's my imagination, or why, no one's going to recognize this. But yet it was meaningful, very meaningful to people. And he took me upstairs after the service and showed me a painting, I think that was done by Florence Becker, and it was a landscape painting with a long winding road, and at the end he says these two little figures are Max and Maxine. So I guess my point there was there's different ways to there's different forms of evidence, like I said, that consciousness does survive death, and mediumship is one. And the thing is, I think people sometimes just expect perfection or detailed responses, and it doesn't come like you and I talking or you and I writing something down. It's sometimes more symbolic or just like I described, very subtle.
Indeed. Now, you started what is called the Medium Certification Program. What is that, and why did you start it?
Okay. So going back to when Soul Shift first came out, I was getting flooded with people calling me or reaching out to me wanting to be referred to good mediums. And it's something I think is very important, because there are some frauds out there that try and take advantage of people.
Sure.
And I think there are also some deluded folks, and probably a lot more of them than frauds, that think that they have the ability, and maybe they have a little bit of it. Like you said, everybody does to some degree, but not enough to give an evidential reading. So I look for evidential mediums to steer people to. Well, most of the people I met at that time were like celebrity type mediums, and they had long wait lists, or maybe, they might charge more because that's their primary focus of what they do for a living, and their notoriety. Maybe it's one of the controls to limit how many people would come to them. So I thought, you know what, there have to be other talented people out there that have this gift that just are lesser known. So I decided to put a program together to start identifying these people through the testing process. And Dr. Emily Williams Kelly, who works at the University of Virginia Division of Perceptual Studies, I got to know her because of an experiment she did, and I looked at her protocols and kind of talked through those with her to understand them. And then my friend Tricia Robertson with the Scottish Society of Psychical Research helped me kind of refine what I ended up doing for the testing process. And today really what happens is if someone wants to apply to get on the website as a certified medium, they have to go through 5 blinded readings. They're done on Zoom with the video off. They don't know the name or the person that they're going to be reading for. They're given the first name of the person once it starts, but that's it. And they have to do this complete reading. It's recorded, and then the sitter transcribes it later and then has to grade all the statements as either correct, incorrect, indeterminable, like a prediction or something. And then they can assign bonus points if they feel it's warranted. And there's 2 different levels of bonus points. There's a 2-point bonus and a 5-point. A 2-point might be like, okay, I have your son here, and his initial is A. And let's just assume the kid's name is Aaron. You say, okay, that's good. You got the first initial. I'll give you 2 points for that. But if the medium says, I have your son here, and the name is Aaron, that might be a 5-point bonus. So putting all this together, we grade it statistically. So they have to have at least 65% accuracy. And we push the statements that can't be identified as correct or correct, we push those to the side unless they have an inordinate number of those. Because we can't really tell. It could come true in the future. It may be something that the person can't really find the answer to know if it's correct or not. But have to be at least 65% accurate and get a total score of at least 75. So they'd either have to be 75% accurate or at least 65% and enough bonus points to push them over 75.
And what percent of people, let's say of 10 potential applicants, what percent do you think make it?
I should have tracked that. I haven't, but I've been doing this since 2014, so we're 9 years in, and I've got about 40 people certified, and I've had hundreds apply. And I'd say more recently, it's been like 1 out of 15 or 20 might pass lately. In the beginning, I was getting, I'd say, a higher percentage, that probably more like 25%, but I think it's down. So but that's okay. I'm trying to find the cream of the crop so that
right.
I'm steering people, especially with grieving people, a reading can really help them, a good reading, but a bad one could set them back.
And the organization Helping Parents Heal, I think, is a brilliant idea and very needed.
Well, thank you. It's interesting how we got to start there, and really that evolved out of the fact that there was no other organization for bereaved parents out there that allows for the open discussion of spiritual experiences and afterlife evidence. So some of the other folks, bled off these other organizations that came to us because when they tried to share, their signs or experiences that happened with them, they were kind of shut down. And we thought, well, that's one of the most healing things you can have, as you're trying to get through something like that, especially a kid passing. It's like the toughest thing you can imagine. There's a lot of other factors too, obviously support from family and friends. Hopefully you've got that. Our organization provides support in the, you're going to meet other people like you who are in the same boat. So you have that in common, and someone who really understands what that's like. I also see a lot of folks who have come through who had feelings of guilt harbored that they wouldn't let go of. They blamed themselves, or they harbored anger at someone else that they felt was responsible. And so learning to let some of those things go helps, and then learning to provide service to others helps. But this hope piece is, the afterlife, knowing that your kids still exist in a different form, perhaps, but they're not gone, and you can still have a relationship. It's just going to be different.
It's got to be the hardest thing for a parent to have to go through, losing a child.
It is. No matter what your beliefs, no matter what your knowledge or faith level, you're not prepared for it. No one is ever prepared for that. It's such a shock.
Do you believe in reincarnation now, Mark?
Well, it's interesting. I do. I don't know exactly how it works or if it's the way we think it works. It's something I've always been open-minded about, but I hadn't really thought about it that much. But in the book, I do share a story where my dad, when I was 3 years old, he was in the car with me, and he asked me not to lean up against the door, and because he didn't want me to accidentally fall out or whatever.
Right.
And apparently I launched into this dialogue about, well, then I'd fall and be broken up into a lot of pieces, but then the angels would come get me, but then they'd make me a new body and make me come back here again.
At 3 years old, you said that?
Yeah, and then he started asking me a bunch of questions, and I was just answering them, I guess, rapid fire, like how many brothers and sisters did you have? How did you die? How old were you? All these kinds of things.
Wow.
So, and that's the researchers who look into that stuff. University of Virginia Division of Perceptual Studies does a lot of that. Ian Stevenson really started that, I believe.
Yep.
But, it's they have so many of these documented cases, and typically, they get it out of young kids. But then by a certain age, I'm not sure whether it's 5, 6, 7, the kids start forgetting that. They lose that memory of the previous incarnation. So apparently at that point, I remembered it.
Pretty dramatic.
Yeah.
Are there a lot of parents out there that have lost children?
Oh, a massive number, yes, and it's happening all the time. I mean, it's kind of sad. I'm glad we exist so we can support them, but we're growing so fast, and it's right now there's just like an epidemic with the fentanyl deaths too.
Oh, geez, yeah, we were just talking about that last hour. It's crazy. Yeah. It's out of control.
It is. There's other things too, but that's just really accelerated it. It's but we're here for those folks, when they do go through that, and I'm glad we can provide support to them because they sure need it.
Mark, through your website, can you get to your Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube accounts?
Yes, I have links to all those. Also on my website, you can link to Helping Parents Heal and link to the certified medium site. And you can link to a site where you can see videos of my dad on the Steve Allen show in 1971 demonstrating psychic phenomenon.
That's a long time ago. Mark, stay with us. We're going to take phone calls with you next hour. The lines are now open. Tom's ready to take your call. Mark Ireland with us, and we'll be back in a moment on Coast to Coast AM.